Well, you know what Arcadias are. They're really green playgrounds. And as a 10-year-old in London, my playground, of course, was a park. So if I'd known the word, I would have probably called that park Arcadian. There were two high grassy mounds in it, about, I suppose, 20 feet long. Brilliant, perfect forts that could be defended against all comers. Our gang was convinced that they were Anglo-Saxon funeral barrows, and playing there one day, I scraped my ankle against a rusty iron plate, proved to be a manhole cover secured by an equally rusty iron chain. Took a bit of effort, but we did finally file our way through the chain. We raised the lid and were greeted by the most fearsome, awful smell. And it was so disgusting that not even the most barbaric funeral customs of the ancient Britons could possibly have produced it. It took us several days before we got up our courage and went in. It was, of course, an air raid shelter, had all kinds of marvelous rubbish, wonderfully ancient, very grungy. Now, there have always been two kinds of Arcadia, light and dark, shaggy, smooth, the golden wheat field, the dark grove. Arcadia has always been a place you can really, really relax in, and also a place you stumble about, feeling not everything is quite right. Arcadia has always been a pretty lie. Of all the landscapes lodged in our shared memory, this is the richest in pure make-believe, a place expressly designed with its opposite in mind, the city. When we think Arcadia, we think therapy, a cure for urban wear and tear. A place of drowsy, do-nothing sweetness, an open-air asylum of peace and harmony where nature has only one expression, the smile, where nothing ever bites or stings, the eggs are always fresh and brown, the winds no rougher than an airy breeze, the water limpid, and the rustics never break sweat. A place, in fact, where it never rains but the grass stays magically green. A place where nothing can possibly ever go wrong. Look hard enough, though, and you'll realize there has always been wildness in Arcadia. Even the most fanciful dream makers of Arcadia have always known this. Nicolas Poussin, the 17th century French artist who lived in Rome for most of his life, was typical of the classicists who supplied the standard features of the poetic scene. Nymphs and shepherds caught in a drowsy golden light, mysterious temples whose forms echoed the outline of gentle hills, manscape and landscape miraculously harmonized. But Poussin and his patrons in the Roman aristocracy knew that many of the original Greek poems that had begun the myth of Arcadia had actually required episodes of terrible grief, of nymphs and shepherds unhinged by suicidal remorse and passion. So Poussin was artful enough to fold these strange, solemn, lethal moments into the sweetness of his landscape, as if he understood intuitively that we actually need wildness along with the tame to bring us up short and sharp on our walks through Arcadia. So the road through Arcadia is not simply a ramble through sweetness and light between trees stationed right and left, perfectly proportioned within the painting. It could also be a meeting with fearfulness, with terror, and with death. A body in the foreground, half hidden from view, caught in the crushing grip of a monstrous serpent. In this most enigmatic and teasing of all Poussin's versions of Arcadia, he gathers shepherds around a tomb engraved with the laconic motto, Et in Arcadia ego. It was an epitaph that Poussin knew could be read two ways, one for each of the Arcadias, light and dark. Read it for Arcadia light, and you'll translate the phrase as though it were being spoken by the man in the tomb. Once I was in Arcadia too. A gentle, wistful, confessional kind of sentence, a sort of visual, resigned shrug of the shoulders. Nothing much more serious than, well, all good things have to come to an end. Read it for Arcadia dark, and you've got something quite different. Something scary in the midst of pleasure, the worm in the bud, the snake in the grass. I, too, was in Arcadia, says the voice, but this time it's unmistakably the voice of death. And if Poussin enjoyed playing on this double meaning, his Italian contemporary Guercino leaves no one in any doubt at all which Arcadia he has in mind. Poussin was the heir to a long tradition stretching back all the way to the ancient Greeks, who imagined the Arcadians as worshippers of Pan, half beast, half god, the original party animal, woolly thighs, cloven hoofs, a maker of wild music on the syrinx pipes, perpetually drunk, insatiably lecherous, prepared to screw pretty much anything and anyone who came his way in the forest depths. Nymphs, comely goatherds, the goats themselves, or all of the above. The real Arcadians in their arid hills were thought of by other Greeks as pure forces of nature, aboriginal, timelessly native to the place, a race that began, so the poets said, before the creation of the moon, generated from the Arcadian soil itself. They were then the earthiest of all men, just as Pan's naughtiness was designed by the gods for a purpose, to ensure the fertility of nature, of fields and flocks. To city dwellers like Athenians, this wild place was Pania, literally the land of Pan, but also the place of panic. If we think of Pan's goatish features as devilish, that's only because of the later Christian tradition that gave Satan a pagan countenance. For Virgil, the greatest of all Latin poets, Arcadia was not a place of panic, it was a state of longing. He'd had his own country estate taken away from him as a punishment for choosing the wrong side in the civil wars that followed the assassination of Julius Caesar. He'd managed to get the land back by crawling contritely before Octavian, later the Emperor Augustus. But in the first of his eclogues, he has a political exile groan with envy at the happy old man who could look forward to dying shaded by his own elms. Happy old man, here amid familiar streams and sacred springs, you shall court the cooling shade. On this side, the hedge whose willow blossoms are sipped by bees shall with their gentle hum soothe you to sleep. Under the towering rock, where the woodsman's song shall fill the air, while wood pigeons and the turtle doves shall coo from the lofty elm. There is a sigh, a catch in the throat, as Virgil conjures up his Arcadia as someone else's enviable dreamscape, its beauties embellished by a sense of loss. And with this sharp sense of longing still in his mind, Virgil changed the face of old Arcadia decisively and forever. Away went the primitive harshness that had coloured even the rustic poetry of the Greeks. Instead, it became a golden land. Another eclogue, the fourth, looked forward to the return of this golden age, when the country might produce fruit and grain with no effort at all, without even the plough and the harrow tearing the soil. Uncalled, the goats bring home their udders, all swollen with milk. So Arcadia, which had once been famous for its savagery, was now a place from which everything beastly had been banished. No lions, no wolves, and especially, of course, no snakes. Even when Virgil did conjure up the world of the gentleman farmer in his Georgics, the ideal creatures are those paragons of domestic virtue, the cow and the bee. The one placid, the other the Boy Scouts of the insect world, workmanlike, disciplined, productive. Virgil writes, "Some watch over the gathering of food. Some within the confines of their homes lay down the narcissus tears of gluey gum from tree bark as the foundation of a honeycomb. To some others it has fallen by lot to be sentries at the gates. And while the old bees, surprise, surprise, are the supervisors, the young workers commute back to their home, in Virgil's wonderful words, their thighs laden with time." The two Arcadias could not be more different then, could they? In the wild version, men look, eat, and fornicate like animals swallowed up by their beastly habitat. In the tame version, the animals are meant, as much as possible, to behave like men. And not only men, in fact, but good citizens.
It was the job of the ideal farmer to turn a wilderness into a gentleman's paradise, the sort of place that Roman writers like Pliny the Younger could make their weekend locus amenus, a place of delight. Pliny deliberately chose the site to be far enough away from Rome to be rid of all the corruption, intrigue and squalor that got on his nerves. But it should be close enough, he specified, that having finished the business of the city, it may be reached with ease by the close of the day. No mere cottage, Pliny's Villa Laurentinum boasted a breezy atrium, hot tubs, a well-stocked library, a garden full of figs and mulberries, and wonderful views over the water and land. But the man-made Arcadia also had to have another quality if it was to be truly sweet: docility, security. Ideally, it ought to be a place from which wildness had been weeded out or banished altogether and kept at bay by fences or high walls. When Christianity replaced paganism as the dominant culture of the West, any lingering attraction to brutishness disappeared with the old Rome. The early medieval church walled itself off against the wilderness, and its monastery gardens were defined by the exclusion of animals. wild men who appeared in tapestries and illuminated manuscripts are depicted as unnaturally hairy, as are their women, their animal fur bearing witness to their closeness to beasts and to the legacy of shaggy old Pan.
There were two reasons why the Christian garden had to be sealed off on all four sides against wild nature. There was, of course, the practical interest, which any gardener will sympathize with, of defending the food and the herbs of the monastery against grazing animals. But there was also a deeper symbolic reason for the closed garden. In Christian theology, after all, the womb of the Virgin was compared to a blessed garden that could spring into fruit without any external insemination. Exactly the opposite, in fact, of the promiscuous Pan who spilled his seed just about anywhere to guarantee the abundance of nature.
The paradise garden of the monks and nuns was not only an Eden, innocent of sin, but a place of spontaneous generation. Virtually everything planted was an invitation to contemplate the Christian life, like the Madonna lilies that, according to the Venerable Bede, symbolized the purity of the Virgin's body, their golden anthers, the radiance of her spirit.
Of course, even in the best patrolled garden, with the highest walls, the most watchful gardeners, someone always leaves the gate open. And from the 14th century onwards, the garden gates were open wider and more often, and what they were open to was pleasure. A great softening of the defences was taking place, so that in the paintings of the Northern Renaissance in particular, with their rugs of flowery meadows, all of nature came to be seen as divinely blessed. And through the pergolas, over the arbours, came all kinds of influences from beyond the closed yard of Christendom. Exotic flowers and fountains from Islamic gardens, herbs, fruits and vegetables from the voyages of discovery, east and west.
But the most influential landscape gardener of all may have been the printing press. By the early 1500s, there were editions of Pliny the Younger's villa letters, the rustic poems of Horace, with their blessings on those who fled the impure city, and above all, the poems of Virgil.
Arcadia became a kind of open-air theatre, a stage set for mysterious and amorous performances. There were little courts all over northern Italy where poets recycled the old Greek and Latin songs of thwarted love between nymphs and shepherds and the mischief of satyrs. Sooner or later, and doubtless much to Pan's satisfaction, sex, music and landscape all came to be wrapped up together in the dreamy, velvety brushstrokes of Giorgione and Titian. Nudes sleeping or virtually inert began to be draped across the landscape, the undulating hills echoing, rather predictably, of course, the curves of breasts, hips and thighs. Jacopo Sannanzaro, a nobleman who, like Virgil, had been exiled from his estate near Naples when he ran foul of politics, wrote the Arcadia, starring, of course, himself as the lovelorn shepherd Sincero, the sincere one. And here is how Sannanzaro's shepherd, Sincero, breathes heavily over the topography of his favorite nymph, Amaranth. From there, descending to the delicate throat, as smooth as marble, I saw her tender bosom, the small, girlish breasts like two round apples. Midway between these could be seen a little path, most lovely and immoderately pleasing to look on, which, as it ended in the secret and shady parts, caused me to think much about such places.
By the time that the 18th century French artist Watteau painted his Fête, gardens like the park of his patron Pierre Crozat at Montmorency had gone well beyond poetic fantasy and were deliberately designed for the rituals of flirting and seduction. In these amorous Arcadias, the formal, open, gravelly avenues of Louis XIV's time were replaced by designs favouring secrecy and intimacy. High hedges, trickling rather than monumental fountains, creeper-strewn walls and urns, and statuary that brought the sport of nymphs and satyrs right back into the shady bower.
Well, there had to be a reaction, of course, against all this moonlight masking. The generation that grew up in the middle decades of the 18th century were possibly among the most self-righteous that has ever imposed itself on the culture of the West. Their gurus were the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who made a reputation biting the aristocratic hands that fed him and preaching the cult of the natural man. Or on the other side of the channel, Edmund Burke, the Irish romantic whose inquiry into the origins of the sublime and the beautiful set off a rage for the spectacular and the thrilling and a contempt for the merely pretty and pleasing. So Arcadia was redesigned yet again. This time, it was meant to look more like its ancient prototype, a place haunted by wild things, full of brutal crags and dark forests. Arcadia, once more, on the rocks.
On a vertiginous outcrop of Shropshire sandstone, a wealthy banker turned gentleman, Sir Richard Hill, created his own version of Arcadia as a theme park of 18th century excitement. No more sitting around necking in the rose garden. Visitors were commanded to take a 10-mile walk through scenery meant to inspire awe and not a little trembling. And for the grand finale, they could grope their way through the tunnels of Grotto Hill. In the last chamber, they would be greeted by a mechanical druid waving a magic wand with a booming voice provided by one of the locals. Dr. Johnson, at least, thought the general effect was admirable, which was about as enthusiastic as he ever got, though he was less happy about being taken through the exit from the Druid's cave out onto the terrifying Raven's Shelf. Pinned against the wall by the croaking birds of death, while the rock wall dropped sheerly away hundreds of feet below.
Part of the attraction of places like Hawkston was that they brought the exotic home. The reading classes, and that now included the middle class, and a good part of the artisan working class too, were all well aware of new worlds in the South Pacific, in Asia and Africa, that had been opened up by the likes of Captain Cook and Mungo Park. The Arcadia of their imagination had grass huts and brilliant birds, and the nymphs and satyrs were now Polynesian and wore garlands of tropical blooms about their oiled, half-naked bodies. Only the disreputable, of course, went shockingly native. There was a way to make even the tropical Arcadia respectable for the middle classes.
Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, it became possible to use steam stoves and pipes to heat great enclosures of glass thrown across ribs of iron and steel so that urban jungles, reptile houses, palm houses, winter gardens would suddenly sprout in the heart of the 19th century metropolis. Steamy empires of palm and pine without the inconveniences of tropical diseases or restless natives. Wildness under glass, a process we can see continuing today to the point where the artificiality is complete.
You folks see over there, unless you want to get a little wet, you better lean in some. That's right, I said you lean in. It's as though we're entering a pool of dangerous hippos now. These animals can be really vicious at times, especially when they're bubbling and wiggling their ears. And every once in a while, you'll get a wow and that'll charge the boat.
The antithesis of artificial wildness is natural authenticity. And no one preached the virtues of authenticity more ardently than Jean-Jacques Rousseau, himself a great believer in the moral value of solitary walks. And the place to find one's true moral personality, Rousseau believed, was in the woodland glade. For his countless disciples, the sylvan Arcadia was then the absolute opposite of the vain fashions of the town. It was the place where only unaffected natural truth counted, the habitat of timelessly simple Arcadian types, peasants and gypsies. It wasn't only philosophers who took to the woods. Artists, too, felt the need to shake off the pretensions and vanities of the city and construct their lives and their pictures in a spirit of unvarnished freshness and simplicity. The group of landscapists most committed to this ideal took their name from a little village in the centre of the old royal forest of Fontainebleau, southeast of Paris. The village was called Barbizon, and they lodged in little inns and cottages that some of them made into their own studios. They painted deep forest interiors, peopled only with heroic and ancient oaks, slender groves of birches, an occasional cowherd leading his cattle to drink in light-dappled brooks. We're right to think of the Barbizon painters as originals, innovators. They really did paint in the open air and lived, at least for a while, in the forest glades. But they were only following the trails laid down by someone now forgotten, yet who arguably had even more influence on our feeling for landscape. His name was Claude François Denecourt, and we should really think of him as the inventor of the most modern Arcadia of all, the hiking trail. Exploring the depths of the woods, far from the old royal hunting roads, he began to map out a whole new landscape of the forest, giving fresh names to rocks, hills, ponds and swamps, the greatest and grandest stands of trees. So Claude François walked and walked and walked, winding his way through the deepest and darkest areas of the forests, treading gingerly past the sleeping population of vipers that infested the woods, and counting the now much depleted numbers of deer and pig. He laid down marks so he could recognize his way back, for his plan was to supply the maximum solitude consistent with guaranteed lack of terror. So he calculated, as if he were an engineer of the picturesque, just how to produce the most striking, various and pleasing prospects. Gradually, the activities of an eccentric ex-soldier tramping around the woods began to arouse the suspicions of the Inspector General of the Forest and his guards. What exactly was this man up to? It was nothing he had done to infringe the forest laws. No one had seen him taking wood illegally or sneaking in and out with an unlawful pig or goat. But there were these painted blue arrows that kept mysteriously appearing on rocks and trees in different parts of the woods. Now, those blue arrows were the syntax of Denicourt's grammar of woodland walks, what gave it direction and coherence. He'd go out at night with a covered lamp and a pot of blue paint beneath his coat and apply them to the precise places he anticipated his walkers would need direction. He was, in fact, inventing the forest trail. It was simple enough, but no one had ever done it before. Denicourt understood intuitively the need of the modern city dweller for designed excitement. And nothing showed off his shrewd grasp of the psychology of protected terror than his presentation of the man who kissed vipers. His name was Guérigny, and before he became famous, he was just simply one of the down-and-out local woodcutters who, like so many others, needed to practice some other trade to keep himself in bread and wine. Guérigny painted houses. He also learned to catch vipers for the 2-franc bounty that Louis Philippe's regime offered in an effort to rid the woods of these pests. When the railway came to Fontainebleau, Guérigny was selling beer and spirits at the station, and Denicourt saw that he could realize his potential as a major tourist attraction. Before long, a special stop at the Gorge d'Apremont in a dark and very scary cave was virtually mandatory in order to watch the chasseur de vipères, the hunter of vipers, and it became a major feature of walk number 1. Guérigny, dressed in a grimy shirt and an oiled cap, would take the snakes from a box on his back and wind them around his neck. He'd then, of course, reassure his audience that, as he said, if one doesn't bother them or impede them, they are the most inoffensive and affectionate creatures in the world. And just to make his point, Guérigny would then grasp a viper in each hand in the prescribed manner, smiling sweetly at them, would plant a tender kiss on the tips of their snouts. Applause not advised, Guérigny told his thunderstruck tourists, since it made the reptiles nerveux, and indeed not just the vipers, but the scores of lizards and grass snakes he kept in sacks around the cave. Denicourt's genius was to see that there could be a mass market for the solitude industry, that Arcadia need not be an aristocratic preserve, that the walls and fences that had kept the plebs out of nature's dreamland could actually be crashed by the people whose labour over the millennia had made the Arcadian fantasy possible. Denicourt's story is a rehearsal of our modern dilemma. For the price of democratic wilderness is the export of urban stress, traffic, pollution, erosion, to exactly the kind of landscapes that were supposed to heal such stress. Is this where Arcadia has finished up? The final indignity, assembly line Artemises, the great procreator Pan, neutered into a garden gnome? The ancient Arcadian meadow, preserved with industrial doses of chemicals as the suburban front lawn? Bring back our old Arcadians, Virgil, Sananzaro, Horace, and one thing about our own remnant of their dream would, I think, shake and amaze them: our obsession with grass. For millennia, it was mere pasture, grazing ground for livestock. And there are those paleontologists who think that although we talk loosely of coming down from the trees, it's really an ancient memory of a grassy savanna that is our most archaic instinct about nature.
That could be very good. That could be very... I don't know what's happened over
But it's not the old grasslands of Homo erectus that Western man has reproduced around the world, continent after continent, shearing away hills, burning woods. It's the fairway, the most demure of all the Arcadias, and also the greediest for colossal systems of artificial irrigation, massive use of pesticides. It's a safe bet that the first American environmentalist, Henry David Thoreau, would not have joined a golf club, even if they would have had him. Thoreau would instinctively and rightly have seen all this as business as usual, and it would probably have confirmed his worst fears of the annexation of nature by the culture of city, the emasculation of Arcadia.
In wildness is our salvation, Thoreau famously proclaimed. But this seems to me to be a phrase that has been seriously misunderstood. For he did not mean, surely, some impossible retreat to an Arcadia that he knew perfectly well had never been, and certainly could never come again. Nor did he mean a flight to some last green Eden. For Thoreau, who was nothing if not prophetic, knew that sooner or later modernity would creep over the globe. He would not have been surprised to have found television sets in the Amazon rainforest. The site of Walden Pond shows us exactly what he truly meant. The deceptively local, familiar place where we might find our true Arcadia. So many Thoreau venerators go to the little patch of birches and the modest pond expecting some sort of primal New England wilderness. They leave the tiny cairn of stones that's all that remains of the cabin where he spent a couple of winters and come away disappointed with the suburban smallness of it all. They can still hear the local train at the back of the woods, its whistle moaning with its load of commuters. And as wilderness experiences go, Walden Pond is definitely not on an epic scale, but that, of course, is exactly the point. For Thoreau's real message to us is that we can, if we see with the right eyes, think with the right kind of attitude, inhale with a good, clean set of lungs, discover that Arcadia had been there in all its wild glory, all the time in our own backyard. One morning, when he was 38 years old, Thoreau discovered a peculiar little plant on one of his walks, the wild, hairy huckleberry. Now, there wasn't much he could do with it. It was certainly too sour to eat, but it did give him fantastic satisfaction to think of its immense endurance in its own quiet place, just as it had been through the centuries of the Indians, and indeed before there had been any Indians at all. To those who were telling him to go seek his wilderness in some remote spot in Labrador, he meant to redirect them to their own backyards, even closer than that, perhaps, towards the landscapes we have been walking these past weeks, the shared landscapes of our mind and memory. The surprising payoff of his message was that to go and look for redemption from the ills of our modern condition in some idea of a nature out there, wild and pristine, that might rescue us from our greed and wastefulness, is actually a crowning folly. For the nature out there turns out to be the nature up here, in our eyes, our mind, our memory. That's all we have, and it's enough. I seem to have reached a new world, so wild a place that the very huckleberries grew hairy and inedible. What's the need of visiting far-off mountains and bogs if an hour's walk will carry me into such wildness? That wild, hairy huckleberry, inedible as it was equal to a domain secured to me and reaching to the South Seas.
It is in vain to dream of wildness distant from ourselves. There is none such. It is the bog in our brain and our bowels, the primitive vigour of nature in us that inspires that dream.